Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Record Live. It is Wednesday afternoon. I feel like every intro that I always do, I say, welcome back, it's Wednesday afternoon, but that is what it is. Today we've got an awesome special guest lined up, and the topic, I'm sure, potentially contrary to the title, because I think a lot of people see the words Old Testament and they think, oh, yawn, whatever. However, our guest today is going to blow it out of the park, I'm sure. And we're going to be looking at the Bible as like a literature text, which I think will be quite interesting. And I mean, Jared, as a writer, having been a writer for many years, I think actually when I mentioned potentially getting our special guest today on, you're quite excited. I'm going to say maybe why that is.
Yeah, I think I first saw Pastor Laurence Turner at the South Australia Big Camp a few years back. He can confirm when he joins us, but it was really fascinating as he dug into the scripture and did some Old Testament stuff and New Testament stuff. I think his theme, his messages were actually in the New Testament, but he really used a lot of that background from the Old Testament, and I really enjoyed it. And probably growing up, I had no concept of the Bible as literature. It just didn't the Bible was the Bible, As I got older, went to college and heard there were classes about the Bible as literature. I didn't take those classes, but that's when it sort of first put into my mind this idea of the Bible as writing. And as I got further in my writing career, I sort of started to notice the differences between authors and books, the different sort of techniques that they used, the little tricks and tips. I often tell people in my news writing workshops that the Gospel of Mark is like a news writer, a journalist. He's excited, he's reporting, and it's very succinct. He tells the story, he gets to the point, and he gives you the main thing all at once. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting way to understand and look at the Bible. And I think our special guest, I'm excited that he's going to unpack that more for us today. And I think we can all learn something today. So, yeah, hopefully you at home who are watching also enjoy this topic today, because I think it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, let us know where you're watching from today. We always love to see your comments, and feel free to ask questions. But without further ado, I'm going to bring Dr. Laurence Turner on the screen. Laurence, thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, so as I said, it's a pleasure to be with you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to have you here. It's 7 a.m. your time, so look, you're certainly an early riser, because I know a lot of people wouldn't necessarily commit to a 7 a.m. Time slot. But
because
look,
you asked me so nicely, you see. You asked me so nicely, I couldn't refuse.
Oh, well, my sweet talking emails seem to be working. So for those who are watching, Dr. Turner, if you haven't met him before, haven't seen his work, he is a scholar, an Old Testament scholar, an author, and an international speaker. And he has taught at both Avondale, which is close to our hearts, being an hour up the road from where we are, and also at Newbold College in England, which I have visited. So both of these places are close to my heart. But Laurence, would you mind telling us, just before we dive into the topic today, what an average day in your life looks like? Where are you placed at the moment?
Oh, an average day in my life. Well, I'm retired now. I know you may find that difficult to believe, looking at my youthful appearance. How can this fellow actually be retired? But I actually retired a little bit early, a few years ago. So my days really spent, I've been involved in a fairly long-term project for the church. There's a new Seventh-day Adventist International Bible Commentary being produced to replace the old, SDA Bible Commentary. And so I was asked to write the commentary on 2 Samuel. And through a series of unforeseen circumstances, once I'd finished 2 Samuel, they then said, would you mind writing 1 Samuel? So that's 55 chapters, from the Bible. That's a lot of work. So a lot of my time in recent past has been working on that book. And of course, the books of Samuel have some of the best stories in the Bible. David, and Goliath, and King Saul, and so on. So that's been quite fun doing. So most of my time is being disciplined enough to spend a bit of time each day, working through that. If this is October, then it must be chapters 24 and 25, that kind of thing.
Wow, that is very admirable. And I imagine you sort of have to keep up with it, because if you take a week or two off, you sort of lose your place and you're like, oh, what was I writing again?
Yeah. And especially writing the commentary back to front. I did 2 Samuel first, and then they say, can you do 1 Samuel? So, so that had its own challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I look forward to potentially reading that when it's released, which I imagine, is that coming soon? I haven't even heard of the Bible commentary.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, it was supposed to be ready by the General Conference session, 2020. So probably by the next next General Conference session. The idea was that rather than publishing the books as they were finished, they're going to publish the whole lot in one go, which means that, well, like my commentary on 2 Samuel, if somebody says, there's nothing in the bibliography in the last 4 years, well, that's quite right, yeah, because I submitted it 4 years ago. That's why.
Yeah.
Seems like a massive undertaking, and so that'll be really important, I think, for the church to have an updated look through the Bible commentary.
Yeah, it'd be quite different from the previous one.
Yeah. So I guess just to start, just by way of introduction, what sort of drew you to the Old Testament? I've always been partial to a good story in the Old Testament, and it seems to be, the history, things are rolling along and exciting things happen. What sort of drew you? How did you get into Old Testament as your sort of more speciality?
Well, how it started, to be perfectly honest with you, is that when I was an undergraduate student, I had a couple of courses in Old Testament, and they were so boring. I mean, they were so boring. I said to myself, look, if this is the word of God, surely it's got to be more interesting than this. And so that's what got me into it. And lo and behold, I discovered it is very interesting. A lot of it depends on the kinds of questions you're asking. So this is the first time that I've met you two, Mary Ellen and Jared, and I might say to you on first acquaintance, hello, what's your name? Where are you from? But if the next time I meet you, I say, hello, what's your name? Where are you from? You keep asking the same questions, you don't get very far. But if you ask a different question, like, what's your passion? What really gets you out of bed in the morning? I get to know you as an individual far more than just a label as to what your name is or where you come from. And it's the same with the Bible and the Old Testament. You change the kinds of questions you're asking. And by asking different questions, I mean trying to find questions which are actually appropriate for asking of this kind of text. And you discover a treasure trove there. It's just a matter of knowing which button to press.
So that makes a lot of sense, because we know that, the Bible is literature. There's different styles of writing, different authors, and that sort of thing. For someone who has no experience in this whatsoever, like understanding the Bible as literature, what are some of those questions that they should be asking, and how do they actually find out what questions to ask in the first place?
Well, I think one place in the Bible, or in the Old Testament in particular, or the Bible in general, if you start with those parts of the Bible which are the most accessible, so don't begin with the genealogies, because they're actually very interesting, but that's for the more kind of advanced reader. I'd say begin with the stories, begin with the narratives, because stories seem to be universal, across all cultures. Everybody knows what makes a good story. But biblical stories are written following different conventions than the ones that we use when we're writing a story or a narrative. And if we read them expecting them to be marching to the same tune, the same beat that we do, we'll misunderstand them. And so if you just have like a small number of alerts in your mind, So when I'm reading this biblical story, what should I be looking out for? So, for example, repetition. For us, repetition is where we say boring. Or if I was reading a student's essay, and they say something, and for the 5th time, allow me to say, I'd write in the margin, I've heard you the first 4, get on with it, And that's the problem when we read a biblical story, is we come across repetition. And so mentally we say, well, I already know this, let's skip this and get on to the action. What we miss is the fact that biblical narratives repeat what is important. It's their way of saying, do you want to know what's important in this story? I'm going to repeat it here, here, and here. And one of the reasons why repetition is used in biblical stories, by the way, is that these stories were originally not written down. We're used to a written culture. We read what's in front of us. But these stories were told orally. So if you are speaking orally, if you're preaching or you're teaching, I soon learned when I was teaching that just because I'd said it once in class did not mean that the students would remember it. What they'd remember it is when I'd say it, and I'd say it again, and I'd say it again. So the repetitions are a reflection that these were stories orally told, and that's where the oral storyteller is wanting you to see this is what's important. There's that. There are other things like biblical stories rarely give you a physical description of somebody. When they do, it's always, always important. So we're used to reading stories about, she walked across the room, a tall, willowy blonde, blue eyes and so on. And well, I hope we don't read too much of that kind of literature, but we're used to filling in the background, and all it's there for is to give us a kind of a visual image. But we might never meet that tall, willowy blonde again. It's just a detail in the story. But if you're in the Bible and you read about a tall, willowy blonde, for a fact, the fact that she's tall, willowy, I'm not exactly sure what the definition of that is, and blonde, you will know that all of those details will have a bearing in the story. So to give you just a brief example, Absalom has long hair. He shaves, he has it cut once a year. He weighs it, I don't know if I couldn't possibly do it, but the last time you went to the hairdresser, did you ask the hairdresser to weigh your hair? So it's emphasizing the hair, and it says the hair of his head. Well, of course it's the hair of his head. He's not talking about the hair on his chest. Of course it's the hair of his head. And so when you know that that's physical description, it's always important. So you begin reading the story looking for his hair. You go into the next chapter, it's not mentioned. The next chapter is not mentioned. Next chapter is not mentioned. But the next chapter, where do we find him? In a tree, hanging by his hair from the tree. So we were told that detail back there, and it's a way of saying, you keep an eye on his hair, it's going to turn up somewhere. So it's a way of drawing you in, all kinds of things like that. And one last thing as well, because this is very important. Biblical stories, you need to remember, will tell us what people say and what they do, but hardly ever do they tell us what they're thinking. Hardly ever will they say what their motivation is. So it's a bit like trying to think of reading a biblical story like watching a movie. In a movie, if it's a good one at least, you see what somebody's doing, you hear what they're saying, but you have to work out what they're thinking by what they're saying and what they're doing. And it's the same in the biblical narrative, and the narrator will rarely pass moral judgment. And this is where we make a colossal error, where I don't know how many times in the Sabbath school class I've heard people say, so-and-so did this and the Bible didn't condemn it, so it must be all right. No, that is fundamentally to misunderstand the nature of biblical narrative, because biblical narratives want to draw us into the situation by saying, you see what they say, you hear what they say, you see what they do. How do you assess that? I'm not going to help you out by giving you the answer. The moral of the story is you have a responsibility to work that out from hints that I'm going to give you in the story. I could go on, but that's keeping those sorts of things in mind enriches your understanding.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm just picking up on something you said there, that the stories are written and should be taken on in a different way than we understand them. Do you think that the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, has suffered from we had an article in our magazine called Disneyfying the Bible. You know, the fact that as kids, perhaps in Sabbath school, we're taught these children's stories. And so we sometimes come to the Old Testament as a children's story. We moralize what happens. We have a surface reading of what happened. We read into people's motivations, and then we miss the broader point that the actual author intended, you know, understanding the context and the culture and the... Can you just unpack that a little bit? Do we suffer from that as Christians, misunderstanding in that way?
Yes, I mean, I rather like that, the Disneyfying of the Bible story. One of the mistakes we make, and I think this is a cultural mistake, is that for us, stories are maybe, you know, for children, you know, bedtime stories. Daddy, mummy, can you tell me a story? You know, that's where we put it. So we don't expect much from them. We expect them to be aimed at the child level. But in biblical culture, the culture from which the Bible arose, stories were used to deal with the most important things in life. So that's why Jesus told parables. You know, so you say, why did Jesus tell parables? And some people might say, because he was the Son of God. No, because he was Jewish. So I sometimes illustrate it like this, you know, if you're standing at a bus stop or waiting for a train somewhere in, you know, Sydney, and the person standing next to you turns to you and says, excuse me, but what is the meaning of life? You know, somebody might do that. Well, how would you answer? And I think that generally speaking, the way we would answer is by saying something that once we got over the shock, perhaps, we'd say, well, I'm glad you asked me that question because I've been thinking about it a lot recently. And I think that if you take into account, you know, this and that, and you consider it from the perspective of here and then, I think any reasonable person would draw the conclusion that the meaning of life is, you know, whatever you think it is. But if you're in ancient Jerusalem and you're standing next to a woman, you know, waiting for the next camel train to come through, and you said to her, excuse me, my dear woman, but what is the meaning of life? She's likely to respond, let me tell you a story. Or have you heard this poem? It's through the involvement in a story or the emotional impact of a poem that the most important aspects of life are explored, rather than this kind of Aristotelian logic that we've got into since the time of the Renaissance. So we think then that stories are sort of pre-intellectual, you know, when in fact stories can reach parts that logic can never get to.
So we can blame the Greeks then, is what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah.
just to follow up with that, do you think that because what role does the individualization of our culture have with how we read the Bible? Because it feels like the cultures that the Bible is based in are very corporate, they're communal. And so the knowledge was passed down, as you said, it was oral, so they would recite it together. There was learning, an emphasis on learning the word and telling the stories. And yet we pick a verse out of a story and we quote it to prove a point, or to make that philosophical argument that you've mentioned. We say God looks not on the outward appearance, but in the heart, from David's story in Samuel there. And we say, well, we read into that a whole bunch of how do we relate to each other and whatever else. But it feels like that's not quite how the Bible was intended. And sometimes we miss that.
Yes, I mean, the Bible arises in a world which is much more communal, much more corporate in its thinking, and I think we can learn a lot from that as far as a church. We talk about the church as a community, when in fact, quite frequently, we are kind of a grouping of individuals. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Australia and New Zealand, but here in this country, the favorite music to play at funerals is Frank Sinatra, I Did It My Way. And that's in some ways the problem. We have a lot of people doing it my way because I'm the most important, and the idea of having any kind of corporate sense. So that makes sense of some passages in the Bible, which at first sight in the Old Testament might seem a bit harsh. In the Ten Commandments, it talks about visiting the iniquity. This is a Hebrew language, visiting the iniquity on the third and the fourth generation. And so we interpret that to mean, okay, so I do something wrong, and my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, yet unborn, are going to bear the guilt of what I've done. And we say that's simply not just. But that's to misunderstand how ancient Israelite culture operated. Because for us, the building block of society for us now is either an individual or a nuclear family. But in Israel, the building block of society was the extended family. It was mum and dad, their children, grandparents, possibly a fourth generation, all living together as a unit. So three and four generations is how people experience life. We experience life together as a unit of 3 and 4 generations. So what this is saying is your sin is not just your business. If I'm married, so if I were to have an affair, it's not just my business. The whole family is impacted by that. There's a corporate dimension to what we say and what we do and how we act. And of course, we can't change our culture into the ancient culture, but we can at least do it the service of understanding the context in which it was given, and maybe asking, could we learn something from that?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question about sort of Adventist culture and how individualism relates to that, but I wanted to follow up with, I guess, a question about that family dynamic, that extended family dynamic. And I'm just thinking, for example, like in primary school in Australia, we're taught about Indigenous cultures, Aboriginal cultures, and how they would pass down stories. And it was this really kind of foreign concept to me at the time. And to be honest, it still is. Like, we don't do that in the Western world, the modern Western world. But have we, as Christians, as people, lost the art of storytelling, I guess, as it is laid out in the Bible or whatever? And how does that impact, I guess, how we share our faith? Do you have anything to say about that? Or could we share our faith better if we actually learned to tell either stories in the Bible or of our own, of our own lives?
Okay, well, that's quite a big question. There are maybe 2 aspects to that, maybe. One is that when we talk about stories, many people, I found this when I've been writing these commentaries, you know, on 1st and 2nd Samuel. If I use the word story, people immediately say, aha, I know where you're coming from, Turner. Fiction, isn't it? The Bible. Well, no. Now, of course, there is some fiction in the Bible, self-evidently, all right? And we know that's from simply reading the text. But that's because as Adventists, we often have a problem with fiction. You know, what can you learn from fiction? I won't get into that, but you can learn a fair bit. So we've got to understand what we mean by story. You know, we're telling stories, we're not telling fibs. What we're doing is we're putting into narrative form our experience, our history, and so on. And then there's a second point. I'm getting to that age where when I say the 2 points, I've forgotten what the second one is. Oh, yes. Until very recently, I think you could say that we were in Western culture very much kind of text-based. You know, we're a written culture rather than an oral culture. I think that's changing. And I think that, well, I know we've been through postmodernism and postmodernism, and I'm not sure exactly where we are. But I think that wherever we are, and whatever you want to call it, people in 2021 are more open to stories. You know, what's your story? Tell me your story. And I think that that's not the only thing in the Bible, of course, but I think we miss a trick if we feel that we can keep using the same kind of discourse, kind of monologue, logical, blow by blow, working our way through the epistle to the Romans, and then wonder why people don't understand or won't listen. It might be an idea. You look at the 28 fundamentals. The 28 fundamentals are written for the eye, you know, that they're written to be read, and there's nothing wrong with that. Could we rewrite them and rewrite them for the ear so people could hear in narrative form or semi-poetic form? Do we have to do our theology in this enlightenment mode of Roman numeral 1a, proof texting our way? Is there more than one way of doing it? And I'd say there is. And if we're going to meet people, we need to meet people using the medium that's going to connect with them. And I think story and imaginative literature is going to meet them better than the theological jargon we usually use.
I think at the very end of that spectrum, it's probably asking the question, you know, could you turn one of the 28 fundamentals into a TikTok? Now that that is where I think it would
yeah,
start.
And if you can't, chances are you don't really understand the fundamental belief.
Absolutely.
Because I know that from my teaching experience that the times when I've confused my students is not when I've known so much that I've given them too much information. The time I've confused them is when I don't fully understand the topic myself. So if you fully understand it, you will be able to simplify it or put it into a different genre.
Amazing. So it'll express itself. The core element will come out in different ways. That's I think that's a really important point that you make about how we communicate with our culture. Narrowing our focus a little bit as we look at ourselves as Adventists. There seems to be a war in the church over hermeneutic, how you understand the Bible, and people who perhaps talk about a plain reading of the Bible, or the Bible literally every word is sort of God breathed, Spirit breathed. They may feel challenged or conflicted when someone comes along and says the Bible is literature. You know, they might be willing to concede that there's poetry in the Bible. They know the Psalms, you know, there's history and there's prophecy. But beyond that, there's a challenge, you know, the concept. If you pressed them, you could bring an Adventist particularly to say, well, there must be fiction in the Bible because we don't believe that there's a literal hell. So Jesus' story about Lazarus and the rich man is fiction, maybe a parable. But how do we navigate through that? Why is it so important to understand the Bible as literature, I suppose? And can you just articulate for us why that doesn't diminish or take away from the importance of the Bible? Why it doesn't have to threaten our understanding of the Bible as the Word of God and with the authority of God, I guess, that comes through in that space?
Yeah. Okay. Well, your first point about the plain reading of the Bible, I know that we hear quite a bit about that. The problem with simply saying, well, you know, we've got the simple method of reading, plain reading. The problem is that in order to have a plain reading, you also need to have a plain reader. And you also need to have a plain text. And if you've got a plain reader and a plain text, you can have a plain reading. The problem is, I'm not a plain reader. I'm a fairly complicated reader, and I think most people are. All kinds of experiences and so on. So, you know, let's keep that in mind. How would I try to show to somebody who is suspicious of me? I was recently denounced as an agent of Satan, so I know what you're talking about. I think is simply to go ahead and show what the potential for this is. So, for example, well, as a general point, I'd say, is the Bible history? Well, yes, of course it's history. But how is that history written? Now, if you go to the history of Israel, for example, and books of Samuel and Kings, you soon come to see that it's not, the Bible, generally speaking, writes its history, not history as chronicle. This happened, that happened, and something else happened, but history as story. So the history is written in a narrative style. That doesn't say anything against the fact that these people existed and these things happened, but how is it written? And I think it's written to engage us, to make it interesting. I remember my doctoral supervisor, I remember saying to me once when I was, you know, doing my research and writing, he said, Laurence, he said, look, if you can't be right, at least be interesting. And that's what these biblical histories are. They're in order to make it interesting, they will write it as a narrative so that it can be told, remembered, and told orally, you know, around the campfire, as it were. And then I think the easiest thing, I think when you talk about these sorts of things in theory, they can be challenging to some people. But if you just go ahead and do it in practice, for example, a few weeks ago, I was asked to preach a sermon on the story of Amnon and Tamar in 2 Samuel. Now that's a very challenging story. You know, it's a story of sexual abuse, rape, and so on. It's not the kind of thing you want to preach, you know. That belongs to the hard, difficult bit of the Old Testament. But when you study it and preach it, you realize it's a story which is told specifically to underline the injustice done to the woman, Tamar. And why not preach it? What's wrong in saying, here's a story which lays bare the emotional and distraught reaction of a woman who was seriously wronged. And you can see in the stories of Samuel this happening and something very similar happening. So as I put it in the sermon at the time, it isn't that history is repeating itself. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And our experience doesn't repeat what we find in the Bible stories, but it does rhyme. It rhymes with it. And the Bible deals with all human experience. And if it can show that it does, what we're really saying is we're not making it relevant, we are showing its relevance to our everyday life now. Once you show the relevance of something to the here and now, I think you're more than halfway to showing somebody, look, you needn't be worried about this. It's God's way of keeping his word living and active in the present and not just affirming what's been done in the past.
Yeah, wow. I love that, trying to make things relevant. And I guess that's one of the things that I think historically Adventists maybe have struggled with, not necessarily Adventists making things relevant to Adventists, but Adventists making things relevant to the wider world. There's a lot of jargon, a lot of just baggage and stuff that we have as a denomination, which is not necessarily a problem, but I think increasingly it's becoming irrelevant. It's just like, what's the point of being an Adventist? Why can't I just be like a Zen Buddhist or whatever? Because the individualism we've already spoken about. And so I guess, what are some of those biases? You mentioned plain reading of the text, right? We're not plain readers. What are some of those blockages or things that we don't like to talk about, or things that we're not willing to address, I suppose, as Adventists? Have you come up against those sort of things in your time, and how can we fix them?
Cool. Well, I think I've got to be careful what I say, but I'm retired now, so that gives me a certain freedom, I suppose. I think one thing that we could do as a church is to increase biblical literacy among members in the church, to give them the opportunity to read and interpret the Bible. And this is one of the problems I have. This is why I say I've got to be careful. I don't mean to offend anybody in what I'm going to say next. But Sabbath school, the Sabbath school lesson, is frequently not helping people to interpret the Bible, but to ensure that they get the right answer. And if you're not going to get the right answer, we'll give it for you at the bottom of the page, just in case you were wondering. So we're not really engaging in reading the Bible. We're finding out what the safe Adventist approach to the Bible is, and there's no need to read the Bible. You just need to know that as Adventists, we believe, if you follow what I mean. Now, allied to that is the problem with seeing the Bible really as a code book of theological ordinances. So we go to the Bible to prove that we are right. We've got the 28 fundamentals, which are obviously correct because they're fundamental beliefs of the church. And we go to the Bible to show that we are right. But the Bible isn't a code book of theological ordinances. Theology, like the 28 fundamentals, theology of that type is what we do with the Bible. But it's not the only thing you can do with the Bible. We've been talking about narratives, but you can read the Psalms, and you can read, my God, why have you forsaken me? We don't sing that. The ancient Hebrews did. They sang it as an act of worship to God. The darkness is my closest friend. O Lord, why do you sleep? In other words, when you read the Bible, it's not a code book of theological ordinances. It's a record of people's engagement with God. And sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's like something else. But when we read scripture, we will meet people who are having the same experiences in principle as we're having, and we can then relate to that. And it's not a matter of proving that Saturday is the Sabbath or that the dead sleep in the graves until Jesus returns. Well, amen. Yes, I don't disagree with that. But we're not living our everyday life just proving theological points. Biblical faith is a verb. It's not an abstract noun. We do it. We don't just affirm it. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but those are helpful.
That's important. I think we do like to get practical on this show. So I guess we often end as we're winding down this conversation in a practical space. What are some sort of helpful ways we can be better readers, better students, perhaps students in light of our conversation isn't the right word, but better readers and engagers with the Word of God? How do we read the Bible better? Can you give us some tools or some starting points? Because what we don't want, or what would be great if people came away from this conversation, is not to think that only scholars or people who know ancient Greek and Hebrew can actually get something out of the Bible. You know, how does the everyday lay person in the pew, the everyday person we meet on the street, how can we help them to get a better reading and get more out of their Bible reading, rather than just looking at it as a rule book for life, like telling us what to do?
Yeah, well, boy. Yeah, answering that would take more time than I have available, I think. But it's I think the first thing, the best way to read the Bible is to read the Bible. I know that sounds a bit daft, but my teaching has shown me that many people experience the Bible secondhand. When I first started teaching, many centuries ago, well, 1981, when I first started teaching in the classroom, what struck me was how many people's understanding of the Bible, perception of the Bible, had been filtered through Uncle Arthur's Bible story at the time. Now, that's maybe not such a popular, but the point was, the Bible was too dangerous an area to go on your own. You needed somebody like Uncle Arthur to Disneyfy it, or to make it palatable, for you to understand. And then in other occasions, when they're reading the text in the Bible, they're not really reading the Bible. They're reading, if they're in Genesis, they're not really reading the Bible. They're reading Patriarchs and Prophets. Or if they're in the Gospels, they're reading Desire of Ages, and saying, that isn't in the text. Now, my point is that what we often do is have a hybrid text. We get a hybrid text made up of the text and Uncle Arthur or Ellen White. Both of them have contributed greatly to the church, and I'm not against that. But neither Uncle Arthur nor Ellen White is the Bible. Last time I checked, anyway. They're not there in the Bible. Spend time with the Bible, and then when I talk about this, I've got a few, various steps, and I can't go through all of those. But one of the great things to do is simply to brainstorm. What is there that you don't understand? Is there something here you don't understand? Write it down, or, type it up or something. What questions does this text raise for you? And then once you've got a list of questions, how are you going to find an answer to the questions. And sometimes, when you ask people a difficult question, they'll end up, looking at the ceiling as if that's where the answer is. It's up there somewhere. No, it's going to be in the text, this text or something like it. So this is an inadequate answer to your broad question. But when I deal with this in churches and so on, I usually go through maybe 6 or 7 steps. That is not to make it complicated. Each step is simple, but you sort of move from the text, on. And frequently, when we read the Bible, we think the most important questions are how or what. But the most important question is so what? So what? Now, I had a reputation for this. Some of my students refer to me as Laurence So What Turner, because I mentioned that sort of. But I think it is a truly important question. We read something and we note, yes, so-and-so said it, it means this, and justification is by faith, right, or whatever. So what? What difference is that going to make when you're eating breakfast tomorrow morning, when you're talking to somebody at work? So what? What are the implications? And moving from the world of the text, looking at the Bible as literature and so on, you see all kinds of things in the text you didn't see before. But when you've seen things you've never seen before, you've got to ask, how do I now move from the world of the text to this world, 2021? And it is frequently not just a simplistic transfer. You've got to take into account cultural differences and so on. That's a whole new area. I'd have to come back again. Sorry, I'm not offering, but I'd need to come back again in order to deal with that.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. And yeah, I'm sorry. Obviously, we don't have more time to go into that. But yeah, there's definitely a difference between going from the world of the text to the real world, from what we normally do, I think, which is going from the world of secondhand information and cultural Adventism to the real world. Like, it's less of a jump, and there's more assumed knowledge there. So yeah, that's a fantastic practical point. Just sitting with the Bible. I actually don't remember the last time I just sat with the Bible without like a secondary text next to it to, just look at, which is probably quite shameful. But yeah, maybe we overcomplicate it. It just seems like
the problem with saying I'm reading the Bible and there's something I don't understand, so I'll reach for a commentary, to help me. What you'll find in the commentary are the answers to other people's questions. But what are your questions? And what are the issues in your Christian community, in your congregation? That other person's point of view in the commentary is interesting to read, but it might not be your question.
Yeah. That seems to be a theme of our interview with you today, Dr. Turner. You're very good at telling us what questions to ask, and I think that's actually one of the most valuable things. So we really appreciate, just learning what questions to ask and learning to have a new perspective on the Bible as literature. Jeffrey Pankhurst commented, he said, a great articulation of the meaning of biblical faith. Thank you. So yeah, thank you, Laurence, for joining us today. We are out of time. But yes, all the best, everyone, until we see you next week for another episode of Record Live. Until then, take care and God bless.
Thank you, everyone.